For 3 decades, one aircraft turned an entire superpower into a frustrated observer. Radar stations tracked it, missile crews prepared for it, interceptors chased it, but it always slipped away. The Soviet Union, armed with thousands of surface-to-air missiles and some of the fastest fighter jets ever built, simply could not touch it. Over 4,000 missiles were launched in attempts to bring it down. Not one ever succeeded. The archive is open. Subscribe to Cold War Black Files and uncover what history tried to hide. That aircraft was the SR-71 Blackbird, a machine so far ahead of its time that it redefined what was possible in aviation. Born out of the secretive Lockheed Skunk Works, it was designed not just to gather intelligence, but to do so in a way that made interception nearly impossible. And it didn't rely on weapons or stealth in the modern sense. Instead, it relied on raw speed, altitude, and engineering brilliance. The story begins in the aftermath of the Cold War, when both the United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a constant struggle for technological and military superiority. Intelligence was everything. Knowing where missiles were placed, how armies moved, and what technologies were being developed could shift the balance of power overnight. Initially, the US relied on high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft like the Lockheed U-2. It flew higher than most Soviet defenses could reach, until it didn't. In 1960, a U-2 piloted by Francis Gary Powers was shot down by an S-75 Dvina missile over Soviet territory. That moment changed everything. It proved that altitude alone was no longer enough. But the next generation of reconnaissance aircraft would need something more, something the Soviets could neither catch nor shoot down. What emerged was the Blackbird. Built primarily out of titanium to withstand extreme temperatures, it was unlike any aircraft before it. At speeds exceeding Mach 3, friction with the air would heat the surface of the aircraft to over 500 degrees Celsius. Conventional materials would simply fail under those conditions. Titanium, however, allowed the aircraft to survive and even thrive at those speeds. But speed was only part of the equation. The Blackbird operated at altitudes above 80,000 feet, skimming the edge of space. At that height, the sky darkened and the curvature of the Earth became visible. It was a domain where few aircraft could operate, and even fewer could perform effectively. The Soviet radar could detect it, but detection did not mean interception. Each time the Blackbird entered contested airspace, Soviet defense systems reacted instantly. Radar operators would track the incoming target, calculating its speed and trajectory. Missile batteries armed with S-75 systems would prepare to fire. Interceptor pilots would scramble, climbing as fast as possible in aircraft like the MiG-25 Foxbat, one of the fastest jets ever built. The MiG-25 was specifically designed to counter threats like the Blackbird. It could reach incredible speeds and altitudes, and on paper it seemed capable of intercepting the American aircraft. But reality told a different story. The SR-71 was always faster, always higher, and always just out of reach. Missiles were launched in volleys, sometimes dozens at a time, and their guidance systems would attempt to predict where the Blackbird would be, calculating intercept points in fractions of a second. But the aircraft's speed created a problem. By the time a missile reached the predicted location, the Blackbird was already miles away. It wasn't just outrunning missiles. It was outrunning the mathematics behind them. Pilots of the Blackbird described the experience as almost surreal. Warning systems would alert them to missile launches, but instead of evasive maneuvers, the standard response was simple: accelerate. Push the throttles forward and let the aircraft do what it was designed to do. Speed was their shield. There was no dogfighting, no dramatic turns, just raw, overwhelming velocity. This created a unique kind of psychological pressure. Soviet forces knew the aircraft was coming. They could see it on radar. They could launch everything they had at it, and yet they could do nothing to stop it. Each failed interception was a reminder of a technological gap that seemed impossible to close. Among the most symbolic missions were the so-called Baltic flights, often referred to as the Baltic Express. These missions involved flying along the edges of Soviet-controlled airspace, daring defenses to react. The Blackbird would streak across the sky, triggering alarms and scrambling jets, only to disappear before anything could reach it. For Soviet personnel, these encounters were more than just operational failures. They were deeply frustrating. The Blackbird didn't just gather intelligence, it demonstrated superiority. It showed that, despite all their advancements, there were still limits to what their systems could achieve. The numbers tell part of the story. Thousands of missiles launched, countless interception attempts, 0 confirmed hits. But the real impact goes beyond statistics. The Blackbird forced the Soviet Union to invest enormous resources into countermeasures, diverting attention and funding into systems that ultimately proved ineffective. Meanwhile, the aircraft continued to operate with remarkable consistency. Its missions spanned continents, collecting intelligence that shaped military planning and political strategy. It flew faster than a rifle bullet, higher than most aircraft could reach, and with a level of reliability that seemed almost impossible given the extreme conditions it operated under. The engineering behind it was just as extraordinary as its performance. The engines, known as Pratt and Whitney J58, were capable of operating in a unique hybrid mode, transitioning from traditional jet propulsion to a form of ramjet operation at high speeds. This allowed the aircraft to maintain efficiency even as it pushed beyond Mach 3. Even the fuel system was unconventional. The Blackbird used a special fuel that was stable at high temperatures and difficult to ignite under normal conditions. In fact, it required a chemical ignition system to start the engines. Every aspect of the aircraft was designed with one goal in mind: sustained high-speed flight. Despite its incredible capabilities, the Blackbird was not invincible in a traditional sense. It didn't rely on armor or defensive weapons. Its survival depended entirely on staying ahead, faster than anything that could be thrown at it. If that advantage had ever been lost, the outcome might have been very different. But for 30 years, that advantage held. The Soviet Union never found a reliable way to counter it. Advances in missile technology, radar systems, and interceptor aircraft narrowed the gap, but never closed it. The Blackbird remained untouchable. Over time, the nature of reconnaissance began to change. Satellites offered a new way to gather intelligence, one that didn't require pilots to risk flying over hostile territory. Gradually, the role of high-speed reconnaissance aircraft diminished. The era of the Blackbird was coming to an end. Yet its legacy remains unmatched. It was more than just an aircraft. It was a statement, a demonstration of what could be achieved when engineering, ambition, and necessity came together. It didn't just collect information, and it reshaped how intelligence operations were conducted. For the Soviet Union, it was a constant challenge they could never fully overcome. For the United States, it was a symbol of technological dominance during one of the most intense periods of global competition, and for those who flew it, it was something else entirely. A machine that operated at the very limits of physics, where the margin for error was razor-thin and the rewards were immense. Each mission was a journey into an environment where few had ever gone, at speeds and altitudes that pushed both pilot and aircraft to their limits. In the end, the story of the Blackbird is not just about speed or altitude. It is about the gap between what is possible and what is achievable. For 30 years, that gap belonged to one aircraft. And no matter how many missiles were launched or how many interceptors were sent after it, that gap never closed. Declassified but not forgotten. Subscribe for the next revelation.